For over 1,000 years, they called it the Empire that never dies. Stretching from the golden walls of Constantinople to the sun-scorched deserts of Syria, the Byzantine Empire stood as Christianity's greatest fortress against the tides of history. But behind those glittering mosaics and sacred icons lay secrets so dark, so carefully buried, that even today historians whisper about them in hushed tones. What if everything you thought you knew about the Byzantine Empire was a lie? What if beneath those holy proclamations and divine ceremonies, something far more sinister was pulling the strings? Tonight, we're going to uncover the truth they never wanted you to discover. Because when you control an empire for a millennium, you learn how to hide bodies, burn evidence, and rewrite history itself. Welcome to my channel. I'm your host, and what I'm about to share with you will change how you see one of history's most mysterious civilizations forever. So close your eyes, let the darkness settle in, and prepare yourself for a journey into the shadows of Byzantium. Most people think they understand the Byzantine Empire. They picture golden domes, religious art, and maybe some vague notion of it being the continuation of Rome. But that sanitized version you learned in school, that's exactly what they wanted you to believe. Because the real Byzantine Empire was built on a foundation of blood, deception, and secrets so explosive that revealing them could topple governments and shatter faith itself. You see, when Constantine moved the capital of Rome to Constantinople in 330 AD, he wasn't just relocating a government. He was creating the perfect laboratory for power, a place where the old Roman brutality could hide behind Christian crosses and holy water. And for the next 1,000 years, that's exactly what happened. But here's what they don't tell you in the history books. The Byzantines didn't just inherit Roman political tactics, they perfected them. They turned assassination into an art form, espionage into a science, and propaganda into a weapon more deadly than any sword. They created systems of control so sophisticated that modern intelligence agencies still study their methods today. And the evidence? Well, that's where things get interesting. Because for centuries, scholars have been finding fragments. A burned manuscript here, a coded inscription there, documents that were supposed to be destroyed but somehow survived. And when you start piecing them together, a terrifying picture emerges. Let me give you just one example of how deep this goes. In 1962, a construction crew in Istanbul was digging foundations for a new building when they broke through into what appeared to be an ancient underground chamber. What they found inside wasn't just archaeological artifacts. It was an entire archive of documents that the Byzantine government had tried to destroy over 500 years earlier. Documents that contained names, dates, and details about operations so secret that even mentioning them was punishable by death. The Turkish government sealed that site within hours. The workers were sworn to secrecy, and to this day, only a handful of people have seen what was discovered in that chamber. But some of those documents leaked out, and what they reveal will make your blood run cold. Tonight, we're going to explore 3 of the darkest secrets that the Byzantine Empire tried to take to its grave. Secrets about their intelligence network that made the modern CIA look like amateurs. Secrets about religious ceremonies that would make your skin crawl. And secrets about how they maintained power for 1,000 years through methods so ruthless, so calculating, that they make Machiavelli look like a choir boy. But before we dive into the abyss, you need to understand something crucial about how the Byzantines operated. This wasn't just an empire, it was a machine. A perfectly calibrated instrument of control that operated on multiple levels simultaneously. On the surface you had the pageantry, the religious ceremonies, the golden crowns and silk robes. But underneath was a web of spies, assassins, and manipulators who would stop at nothing to preserve their power. The Byzantines understood something that most empires never figured out. True power isn't about controlling territory, it's about controlling information. And they were the absolute masters of information warfare, centuries before that term was even invented. They had agents in every court in Europe, every monastery, every trading post from London to Baghdad. They knew what your enemies were planning before your enemies knew it themselves. They could start wars or prevent them with a single forged letter. They could make saints or create heretics with nothing more than a carefully planted rumor. But perhaps most terrifyingly of all, they understood that the greatest secrets aren't the ones you hide from your enemies. They're the ones you hide from your own people. Because when your subjects believe they're living in God's chosen empire, they'll do anything to defend it. Even if that empire is built on lies so monstrous that the truth would destroy their faith forever. Now, you might be thinking, this sounds like conspiracy theory nonsense, and I understand that skepticism. But here's the thing about the Byzantines. They were meticulous record keepers. They documented everything, even their own crimes. They just made sure those documents were hidden, where no one would ever find them. Except sometimes, people do find them. Like that construction site in Istanbul, or the monastery in Greece where renovations in 1978 uncovered a wall cavity filled with scrolls that were supposed to have been burned 600 years earlier, or the private collector in Vienna who discovered that his family's Byzantine manuscript contained invisible ink that only appeared under ultraviolet light. Each discovery is like finding a piece of a massive, horrifying puzzle, and the more pieces we find, the clearer the picture becomes. The picture of an empire that survived not through divine favor, but through methods so dark that they make the worst dictatorships of the modern era look restrained. Let me share something that will give you just a taste of what's coming. In 1453, when Constantinople finally fell to the Ottoman Turks, the last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI, wasn't found on the battlefield where history says he died heroically defending his city. He was found 3 days later in the basement of the Hagia Sophia, surrounded by documents he was desperately trying to burn. Documents that contained records of operations stretching back centuries. The Ottomans managed to save some of those papers before the fire consumed them all. And what they found was so shocking that Sultan Mehmed II, a man who wasn't exactly squeamish about violence, reportedly went pale when he read them. Those documents revealed that the Byzantine Empire hadn't been slowly declining for centuries, as historians claim. It had been methodically eliminated by its own secret apparatus, sacrificed piece by piece to preserve the core of power in Constantinople. But why would they destroy their own empire? That's where the first of our dark secrets begins to emerge. Because the Byzantines had learned something that terrified them more than any foreign invasion. They had discovered that their own system had become so corrupted, so monstrous, that it was beginning to consume itself from within. The intelligence network they had created to protect the empire had evolved into something else entirely, something that no longer served the emperor or the people, or even the state. It had become a parasite, feeding on the empire itself, growing stronger as everything around it grew weaker. And the men who ran this shadow empire? They weren't loyalists or patriots. They were something far more dangerous. They were true believers in a cause so secret, so hidden, that even today we can only guess at its real purpose. But the evidence suggests it wasn't preserving the Byzantine Empire at all. It was preparing for something else. Something that would outlast empires, outlast governments, outlast nations themselves. This brings us to our first dark secret, and it's one that will fundamentally change how you think about medieval history. Because what the Byzantines created wasn't just an intelligence service, it was the blueprint for something that still exists today, something that operates in the shadows of our modern world, pulling strings and manipulating events in ways that would make the old emperors proud. The organization was known by many names throughout its 1,000-year existence. The Scholae Palatinae, the logothetes of the secret, the keepers of the sacred silence. But to those who knew of its existence, it was simply called the Apparatus. And what made the Apparatus different from any other intelligence service in history wasn't its scope or its methods. Though both were extraordinary, it was its ultimate loyalty. You see, most spy networks serve their government. The apparatus served something else entirely. It served an idea. An idea so powerful, so all-consuming, that its agents would betray emperors, destroy cities, and sacrifice entire populations to preserve it. And that idea, it wasn't the glory of Byzantium, or the spread of Christianity, or the preservation of Roman law. It was the belief that true power could only be maintained by those who understood that human beings were fundamentally unworthy of the truth, that the masses needed to be managed, controlled, and, if necessary, eliminated for the greater good. The apparatus believed that they alone possessed the wisdom to guide humanity, and that any price paid to maintain that guidance was justified. This wasn't just political cynicism. This was a religious conviction, a sacred mission that transcended any earthly empire. And the evidence suggests that when the Byzantine Empire finally fell, the apparatus didn't die with it, it simply relocated. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand how the apparatus could survive the death of the empire that created it, we need to understand how it operated. And that means diving into the second of our dark secrets, the true nature of Byzantine religious ceremonies. Everyone knows that the Byzantines were deeply religious. What they don't know is that beneath the public ceremonies, beneath the golden icons and sacred hymns, was another layer of ritual entirely. Ceremonies that had nothing to do with Christianity and everything to do with binding souls to purposes that would horrify any true believer. These weren't just political oaths or loyalty ceremonies. These were rituals designed to fundamentally alter the participants' perception of reality itself, to create individuals who could commit any act, no matter how monstrous, and genuinely believe they were serving God's will. The evidence for these secret ceremonies comes from the most unlikely source, the Byzantines' own saints. Because scattered throughout the official religious records are accounts of holy men and women who experienced visions so disturbing, so alien to Christian doctrine, that the Church had to work overtime to explain them away. But when you read these accounts carefully, when you look past the official interpretations, a pattern emerges. These weren't divine visions at all. They were the psychological aftermath of exposure to something that broke the human mind in very specific ways. Something that left its victims convinced that they had touched the divine, even as it turned them into willing instruments of an agenda they could never fully comprehend. The most chilling evidence of these psychological ceremonies comes from a document discovered in 1991, the private collection of a Romanian monastery. The manuscript, written in a mixture of Greek and Latin, appears to be a training manual for what the Byzantines called shepherds of souls. These weren't priests or monks in any conventional sense. They were specialists in human manipulation, trained in techniques that modern psychologists would recognize as advanced forms of mind control. The manual describes a process called sacred unbinding, where selected individuals would be subjected to a series of rituals designed to strip away their natural psychological defenses. The process began with isolation, often in underground chambers beneath Constantinople's most holy sites. For weeks, candidates would be deprived of normal human contact, fed specific combinations of herbs and substances, and exposed to carefully orchestrated sensory experiences. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. The manual includes detailed anatomical drawings showing pressure points on the human skull, along with instructions for applying precise amounts of pressure to induce what they called divine receptivity. Modern neuroscientists who have examined these diagrams believe they represent a sophisticated understanding of how to trigger specific neurochemical responses in the brain. The end result was an individual who had been psychologically rewired to perceive commands from their handlers as divine revelations. They would commit murder, start wars, or destroy entire communities while genuinely believing they were carrying out God's will. And because their conditioning was so complete, they would pass any test of sincerity. Even under torture, they would maintain their absolute faith in their mission. These shepherds of souls weren't just agents. They were weapons. Human weapons programmed to operate independently for years or even decades, carrying out complex operations while maintaining perfect cover as ordinary citizens, merchants, or even clergy. And the evidence suggests that the apparatus deployed hundreds of them throughout Europe and the Middle East. Consider the case of Brother Matthias, a seemingly devout monk who lived in a French monastery in the 12th century. For 20 years, he was known for his piety, his scholarship, and his dedication to caring for the sick. Then, in 1187, on the exact same day that Saladin recaptured Jerusalem, Brother Matthias suddenly began experiencing visions. These visions told him to poison the monastery's water supply, which he did without hesitation, killing 37 of his fellow monks. When questioned before his execution, Matthias claimed he had received direct orders from an angel of God. He showed no remorse, no doubt, no sign that he understood the horror of what he had done. He died believing he was a martyr. But French investigators found something interesting in his cell, a small bronze medallion bearing symbols that matched artifacts found in Byzantine sites. Symbols that appeared nowhere in Christian iconography. The timing wasn't coincidental. The apparatus had somehow known that Saladin would take Jerusalem, and they had activated a sleeper agent hundreds of miles away to create chaos and confusion among the Crusader forces. This wasn't just intelligence gathering, this was strategic manipulation on a level that wouldn't be seen again until the 20th century. But the shepherds of souls were just one component of the apparatus. They also maintained what they called the living archive, a network of individuals who served as human repositories of the organization's deepest secrets. These weren't written records that could be stolen or destroyed. These were people who had been trained from childhood to memorize vast amounts of coded information, carrying in their minds the complete operational history of the Shadow Empire. The living archive worked on a cellular structure. Each individual knew only their specific piece of the larger puzzle, but together they formed a complete record of the apparatus's activities spanning centuries. When one member died, their knowledge would be transferred to multiple successors through a process that combined memory techniques with the same psychological conditioning used on the shepherds. This system was so effective that when the Mongols sacked Kiev in 1240, destroying what they believed were all the Byzantine intelligence records in the region, they had actually accomplished nothing. The real intelligence was walking around in the heads of merchants, craftsmen, and farmers who appeared to be ordinary citizens, but were actually living libraries of state secrets. The existence of the living archive explains one of the great mysteries of Byzantine history: how the empire could suffer catastrophic military defeats, lose vast territories, see entire armies destroyed, and yet somehow always seem to know exactly what their enemies were planning next. It wasn't divine providence or superior intelligence gathering. It was a human database that could never be completely eliminated. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the living archive was its selection criteria. The apparatus didn't recruit adults and train them to memorize information. They took children, usually between the ages of 5 and 8, and subjected them to a process they called sacred grafting. These children would be removed from their families under various pretexts and taken to hidden facilities where they would spend years having information literally burned into their brains through repetition, sensory deprivation, and chemical enhancement. The process was brutal. Many children didn't survive. Those who did emerged as perfect human storage devices, capable of retaining vast amounts of data while maintaining completely normal external personalities. They would be returned to society with false memories of their missing years, living ordinary lives while carrying secrets that could topple kingdoms. A document discovered in 2003 the walls of a renovated building in Thessalonica provides a glimpse into this nightmare. It's a progress report on a group of 12 children undergoing sacred grafting, written by someone identified only as the Keeper of Small Gardens. The report describes the children's responses to various forms of conditioning with the clinical detachment of a laboratory technician discussing test subjects. Subject 7 shows excellent retention of the Damascus protocols, but continues to experience emotional disturbances during the third-level implantation process. Recommend increasing the soma dosage and extending the isolation period. Subject 9 has achieved complete integration and can be released for field placement within the month. Note: ensure complete memory cleansing of the conditioning period before insertion into target family. The casual tone of the document is perhaps more chilling than its content. This wasn't seen as child abuse or torture. To the apparatus, it was simply another operational necessity, as routine as training soldiers or maintaining weapons. They had convinced themselves that they were creating a better world, and any individual suffering in service of that goal was not just acceptable, but virtuous. This brings us to the third and most horrifying of the Byzantine Empire's dark secrets, the true purpose behind everything they did. Because all of this, the apparatus, the shepherds of souls, the living archive, the secret ceremonies, wasn't created to preserve the Byzantine Empire. It was created to outlast it. The evidence suggests that sometime in the 11th century, the leadership of the apparatus came to a startling conclusion. They realized that empires rise and fall, that nations come and go, that even religions evolve and change over time. But they believed they had discovered something eternal, something that could survive any historical upheaval, the human need to be controlled. The apparatus began to see itself not as servants of the Byzantine state, but as custodians of a sacred truth about human nature. They believed that most people were fundamentally incapable of governing themselves, that democracy was a dangerous illusion, and that true stability could only be achieved through the guidance of an enlightened elite who understood the deeper patterns of history. This wasn't just political philosophy. This was a religious revelation, a divine mandate that transcended any earthly authority. And once they accepted this mission, the fate of the Byzantine Empire became irrelevant. In fact, allowing the empire to fall might even serve their purposes, forcing their organization to evolve and adapt in ways that would make it stronger. The evidence for this startling theory comes from the most unlikely source: the Byzantines' own financial records. Buried in centuries of trade documents, tax receipts, and banking transactions is a pattern that only becomes visible when you look at the data across multiple generations. Resources that should have been used to defend the empire were instead being systematically diverted to fund operations that had nothing to do with immediate military or political needs. Gold that could have hired mercenaries was instead financing the construction of hidden facilities across Europe. Grain that could have fed Constantinople's defenders was being shipped to remote locations and stored in underground warehouses. Most tellingly, enormous sums were being spent on what the records describe as educational initiatives in regions that the Byzantines had never controlled and showed no interest in conquering. When you map these expenditures against historical events, a terrifying picture emerges. The apparatus wasn't just preparing for the fall of the Byzantine Empire. They were actively facilitating it, ensuring that when Constantinople finally fell, their organization would already be established in dozens of other locations, ready to continue its mission under new names and new covers. The fall of Byzantium in 1453 wasn't the end of the story. It was a graduation ceremony. But if the apparatus survived the fall of Constantinople, where did it go? The answer lies in one of the most carefully orchestrated deceptions in human history. Because while the world watched the Ottoman cannons breach the Theodosian walls, something else was happening in the shadows of the dying empire. Something that would make the Great Escape look like a children's game. In the months leading up to the final siege, ships began departing Constantinople under cover of darkness. Not refugee vessels fleeing a doomed city, but carefully planned operations moving what the Byzantines called their sacred cargo. These weren't treasures or religious artifacts. They were people. Hundreds of individuals who carried in their minds and bodies the complete operational knowledge of a 1,000-year-old shadow empire. The destinations weren't random. Venice, Genoa, Naples, Marseille. London, even distant cities like Novgorod and Kiev. But here's what makes this migration so sinister. These people didn't arrive as refugees. They came with established identities, complete family histories, and what appeared to be legitimate business connections. They had been preparing for this transition for decades, possibly centuries. A Venetian merchant who suddenly appeared in 1454 with extensive trade connections throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. A scholar in Paris who seemed to possess an impossibly deep knowledge of ancient texts. A banker in Florence whose financial innovations would help fund the Renaissance. A ship captain in Genoa whose routes seemed to anticipate political changes years before they occurred. These weren't coincidences. They were placements. The apparatus had spent generations building false identities and establishing cover stories that would allow their agents to integrate seamlessly into European society. When Constantinople fell, they simply activated a network that had been waiting in the shadows for exactly this moment. But the most chilling evidence of this planned migration comes from a source you'd never expect: Renaissance art. Hidden within the paintings and sculptures of the 15th and 16th centuries are symbols and references that only make sense if you understand the secret language of the apparatus. Angels with hand gestures that match Byzantine intelligence codes. Architectural details in religious scenes that correspond to safe house locations across Europe. Even color combinations that served as recognition signals for agents operating in different cities. Take Botticelli's Birth of Venus, painted around 1485. Art historians have always been puzzled by certain details in the painting that seem inconsistent with classical mythology. But when examined through the lens of apparatus symbolism, these details form a coherent message about operational procedures in Italian city-states. The painting isn't just art. It's an encrypted intelligence briefing disguised as Renaissance masterpiece. This brings us to one of the most disturbing possibilities raised by recent discoveries. If the apparatus successfully transplanted itself into Renaissance Europe, what role did it play in shaping the modern world? Because the evidence suggests that many of the political, economic, and social developments we attribute to natural historical evolution may have been carefully orchestrated by an organization that viewed human history as a chess game to be won rather than a story to be lived. Consider the printing press, invented by Johannes Gutenberg around 1440. Traditional history tells us this was a revolutionary technology that democratized knowledge and helped break the Catholic Church's monopoly on information. But Byzantine financial records suggest something different. Substantial sums were invested in printing operations across Europe decades before Gutenberg's famous Bible. Someone was systematically funding the development and distribution of printing technology. Why would the apparatus want to spread printing? Because they understood something that wouldn't become clear until centuries later. Controlling information isn't about preventing its spread. It's about controlling what gets spread. If you can influence which books get printed, which ideas get circulated, which stories become accepted as truth, you don't need to suppress knowledge. You can shape it. The same pattern appears in banking, exploration, even religious reformation, the financial networks that funded Columbus's voyages, the political movements that sparked the Protestant Reformation, the economic theories that would eventually create modern capitalism. All of them show signs of coordination, of guidance from an invisible hand that seem to understand the long-term consequences of immediate actions. This isn't to say that every historical development was controlled by the apparatus, but the evidence suggests they had learned to identify and influence what they called leverage points, moments in history where a small intervention could produce massive, long-term changes. Like a skilled martial artist using an opponent's momentum against them, the apparatus learned to guide historical forces rather than oppose them. The most terrifying example of this strategy concerns the European witch hunts of the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. On the surface, These appear to be spontaneous outbursts of religious hysteria and social tension. But when you examine the patterns of accusations, the timing of trials, and the backgrounds of the accusers, something else emerges. Many of the most prominent witch hunters, the authors of treatises on demonic possession, the judges who presided over mass trials, had connections to individuals who can be traced back to the Byzantine diaspora. They possessed knowledge of psychological manipulation techniques that were remarkably similar to those described in the sacred Unbinding manual. They used interrogation methods that produced the exact types of confessions needed to justify further persecution. The witch hunts weren't just religious persecution. They were field tests of mass psychological manipulation, experiments in social control that allowed the apparatus to refine their techniques on entire populations. They learned how to create hysteria, how to direct it towards specific targets, how to use fear to make rational people commit irrational acts. And perhaps most importantly, they learned how to make people believe that their manipulation was actually divine inspiration. The scope of this experimentation becomes clear when you realize that the witch hunts claimed between 40,000 and 60,000 lives across Europe. That's not just persecution. That's industrial-scale testing of human behavior modification techniques, and the knowledge gained from these experiments would be applied to far larger projects in centuries to come. But the apparatus wasn't just interested in controlling individuals or even communities. Their ultimate goal was something far more ambitious, the creation of what they called guided civilization. This was a society that appeared to be free, democratic, and self-governing, but was actually being steered by invisible influences toward predetermined outcomes. The evidence for this long-term project is scattered across centuries of seemingly unrelated historical developments. Educational systems that appeared to promote critical thinking, but actually taught people to think within carefully defined parameters. Economic theories that promised prosperity, but created dependencies on systems controlled by hidden interests. Political philosophies that celebrated freedom while establishing mechanisms for subtle manipulation. Take the concept of the modern nation-state, which emerged during the Renaissance and reached its full development during the Enlightenment. This appears to be a natural evolution from feudalism toward more rational forms of government. But Byzantine documents suggest something different. They describe nations as administrative zones within a larger management system, temporary constructs that could be modified or eliminated as needed. This perspective explains many of the apparent contradictions in modern political history. Why democratic nations consistently make decisions that seem to go against the will of their people. Why economic policies that obviously benefit a small elite get implemented despite widespread opposition. Why educational systems that claim to promote independent thinking produce generations of people who think remarkably similar thoughts. It's not that democracy is fake or that voting doesn't matter. It's that the range of acceptable choices has been carefully curated by people who understand that the most effective control is the kind that feels like freedom. Give people the right to choose between options A and B, and they'll feel empowered even if both options lead to the same predetermined outcome. This brings us to perhaps the most disturbing question raised by the Byzantine dark secrets. If the apparatus has been operating for over 500 years since the fall of Constantinople, what has it become today? Because an organization that survived the transition from medieval empire to Renaissance city-states to modern nation-states has demonstrated a level of adaptability that suggests it could survive any historical change. The answer may be hiding in plain sight, scattered across the institutions and systems that shape our daily lives. Banking networks that seem to operate according to their own logic, regardless of national policies. Educational curricula that produce remarkably similar worldviews, despite being implemented in vastly different cultures. Media organizations that somehow manage to coordinate their coverage of major events without any apparent central authority. International organizations that claim to serve humanitarian purposes, but seem more interested in gathering data about human behavior. Think tanks that influence government policy while maintaining carefully obscured funding sources. Academic institutions that shape intellectual discourse through processes that appear scholarly but follow patterns that would be familiar to anyone who understood Byzantine information warfare. Even our technology shows signs of this influence. Social media platforms that claim to connect people but actually isolate them in carefully crafted information bubbles. Search algorithms that appear to provide objective information but actually guide users toward predetermined conclusions. Artificial intelligence systems that are supposed to serve human needs but somehow always seem to serve the needs of their creators more effectively. The genius of modern apparatus operations, if they exist, would be their invisibility. Unlike the crude totalitarian systems of the 20th century, which relied on obvious oppression and propaganda, a mature version of the Byzantine system would be nearly impossible to detect. It would feel like freedom, look like democracy, and function like choice, while actually being none of those things. But perhaps the most chilling possibility is that the apparatus has evolved beyond human control entirely, that the systems they created to manage civilization have become self-sustaining, operating according to their own logic regardless of what any individual or group might want. Like a computer virus that outlives its creator, the Byzantine approach to social control may have become embedded so deeply in our institutions that it continues to function even if the original organization no longer exists. This would explain why so many of our modern problems seem immune to obvious solutions, why democratic governments consistently fail to address issues that their citizens clearly want addressed, why economic systems continue to produce inequality, despite widespread recognition that extreme inequality is socially destructive. Why educational institutions that claim to promote critical thinking produce graduates who seem incapable of questioning fundamental assumptions about how society should work. It's not that there's a conspiracy in the traditional sense, with secret meetings and coordinated plans. It's that the conspiracy has become the system itself, embedded so deeply in our social structures that we mistake it for natural law. We've been taught to see the effects of manipulation as the inevitable results of human nature, market forces, or political necessity. The Byzantine Empire may have fallen in 1453, but its greatest creation, a method of social control so sophisticated that its subjects never realize they're being controlled, may be more powerful today than it ever was when backed by imperial armies and religious authority, because the most perfect prison is the one where the inmates believe they're free. And that raises the final, most terrifying question of all. If this is true, if we're living inside a system designed by the inheritors of Byzantine shadow operations, then what would it take to break free? How do you escape from a prison you can't see? How do you fight an enemy that may no longer exist, but whose legacy continues to shape every aspect of your reality? The answer may lie in understanding that the first step toward freedom is recognizing the cage. And once you start looking for the bars, you begin to see them everywhere. The evidence is all around us, but it requires a different kind of vision to see it. A vision trained to recognize patterns that span centuries rather than years, to identify connections that appear accidental but follow mathematical precision, to understand that the most successful deceptions are the ones that take in their own manipulation victims, complicit something as mundane as your morning commute. You wake up, check your phone for news that's been carefully curated by algorithms you don't understand, drink coffee grown in countries whose governments were shaped by economic policies you never voted for, and drive to work on roads whose construction was financed through systems that concentrate wealth in ways that seem natural but follow patterns established centuries ago. Every choice you make feels personal, individual, free. But when you zoom out and look at the aggregate data, something remarkable emerges. Millions of people making supposedly independent decisions that somehow produce outcomes that benefit the same small group of institutions, generation after generation. It's as if humanity is performing an elaborate dance choreographed by someone who died 500 years ago. This is what the apparatus understood better than any organization before or since. True power lies not in forcing people to do what you want, but in creating conditions where they want to do what serves your purposes. It's the difference between a dictatorship and what we might call a guided democracy, a system that produces predetermined outcomes while maintaining the illusion of choice. But here's where the Byzantine legacy becomes truly sophisticated. They didn't just create a system of control, they created a system that could evolve, adapt, and improve itself over time. Like a living organism, it responds to challenges by becoming stronger, more resilient, more difficult to detect. When the printing press threatened to democratize information, the inheritors of Byzantine methods didn't try to suppress it. Instead, they learned to control what got printed. When mass education threatened to create too many independent thinkers, they didn't ban schools. They designed curricula that channeled thinking in useful directions. When democracy threatened to give people real power, they didn't abolish voting. They learned to manage the electoral process in ways that preserved existing power structures while giving people the satisfaction of participation. Each challenge that should have weakened the system instead made it more sophisticated. Like a virus that mutates to overcome immune responses, the Byzantine approach to social control has evolved to overcome every defense mechanism that human societies have developed. Consider the phenomenon of manufactured controversy. In our modern world, we're constantly bombarded with debates that seem urgent and important. Liberal versus conservative, capitalism versus socialism, nationalism versus globalism. These debates consume enormous amounts of energy and attention, dividing populations into hostile camps that view each other as existential threats. But when you step back and look at the actual policies implemented, regardless of which side wins these debates, you notice something strange. The fundamental structures of power remain remarkably stable. The same institutions continue to accumulate wealth and influence. The same types of people continue to make the decisions that shape everyone else's lives. The debates that feel so important to the participants serve mainly to channel their energy away from questions that might actually threaten the existing order. This is a technique the Byzantines called controlled opposition, the practice of creating and managing conflicts that give people the impression of choice, while ensuring that all available options serve your purposes. It's like offering someone the choice between chocolate and vanilla ice cream while never mentioning that both flavors contain the same mind-altering drug. The genius of this approach is that it turns the natural human tendency toward independent thinking into a tool for maintaining conformity. People feel rebellious and free when they choose their side in the manufactured conflict, never realizing that the conflict itself was designed to prevent them from seeing the real choices they're not being offered. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Byzantine legacy is how it's shaped our understanding of human nature itself. We've been taught to believe that hierarchy, inequality, and the concentration of power in the hands of elites are inevitable results of natural human tendencies. Competition, greed, and the desire to dominate others are presented as hardwired into our species. Yet archaeological evidence suggests that for most of human history, our ancestors lived in relatively egalitarian societies where extreme concentrations of power were rare and temporary. The idea that some people are natural leaders while others are natural followers, that some deserve wealth while others deserve poverty, that some have the right to make decisions while others have the obligation to obey, these ideas aren't ancient truths about human nature. They're relatively recent innovations that serve the interests of those who benefit from hierarchical systems. The apparatus understood that if you can convince people that your system of control reflects natural law rather than artificial construction, they'll defend it even when it works against their own interests. Slaves who believe slavery is natural don't rebel. Workers who believe poverty is a personal failing rather than a systemic feature don't organize. Citizens who believe their political choices are meaningful don't question why their votes never seem to produce the changes they want. This brings us to one of the most carefully guarded secrets of the Byzantine inheritance: the role of education in maintaining social control. Modern educational systems present themselves as institutions designed to develop human potential and create informed citizens. But when you examine their actual structure and function, a different picture emerges. Schools don't teach critical thinking in any meaningful sense. They teach people to think within predetermined frameworks, to accept certain assumptions without question, and to mistake the ability to manipulate abstract symbols for genuine understanding. Students learn to compete with each other for artificial rewards, while cooperating in maintaining systems that limit their real opportunities. The curriculum isn't designed to create independent thinkers. It's designed to produce what the Byzantines called functional citizens, people who have enough knowledge to perform useful tasks but not enough understanding to question the system that assigns those tasks. They can solve complex mathematical problems but can't analyze the mathematical assumptions underlying economic theories. They can memorize historical facts, but can't recognize historical patterns that repeat across centuries. Most insidiously, modern education teaches people to trust experts and authorities, rather than their own observations and reasoning. Students learn that knowledge comes from approved sources, that questioning established wisdom is dangerous, and that their role is to receive and repeat information rather than to generate and evaluate it independently. This creates a population that feels educated and informed, while actually being remarkably easy to manipulate. They know enough to feel superior to those with less formal education, but not enough to recognize when they're being deceived by those with more. They can engage in sophisticated discussions about complex topics, while never questioning the fundamental premises that shape those discussions. The result is a society where the most educated people are often the most thoroughly indoctrinated, where intelligence becomes a tool for rationalization rather than investigation, where critical thinking is replaced by what we might call approved skepticism, and the practice of questioning only those things that authorities have designated as questionable. But the Byzantine legacy goes even deeper than education. It shapes our understanding of reality itself through what they called narrative architecture, the practice of constructing stories about how the world works that make certain possibilities seem natural while making others seem impossible or absurd. Consider how we think about economic systems. We're taught that markets are natural phenomena, governed by laws as immutable as gravity. Supply and demand, competition, the profit motive, these are presented as fundamental features of human behavior rather than artificial constructs that serve particular interests. Yet markets, as they exist today, require enormous amounts of government intervention to function. Property laws, contract enforcement, patent systems, corporate liability shields, tax policies, regulatory frameworks, military protection of trade routes. All of these represent massive state involvement in supposedly natural market processes. The narrative that markets are natural, while government intervention is artificial, serves to hide the fact that our current economic system is the result of centuries of conscious design by people who understood exactly what outcomes they too wanted to produce. When people complain about inequality or environmental destruction or the concentration of wealth, they're told these are unfortunate but inevitable consequences of natural market forces, not predictable results of deliberately constructed systems. This narrative architecture extends to every aspect of social life. We're taught that nationalism is a natural human tendency rather than a relatively recent invention designed to make people willing to die for the interests of strangers who happen to share their geographical location. We're told that representative democracy is the highest form of human political organization, while systems that might actually give people control over their lives are dismissed as utopian fantasies. We accept that most people will spend the majority of their waking hours doing work that they find meaningless or actively harmful, not because this arrangement serves any useful purpose, But because we've been taught to believe that meaningful work is a luxury only available to a fortunate few, we assume that most important decisions about technology, environment, and social organization should be made by small groups of experts and investors, rather than by the people who will be affected by those decisions. All of these assumptions feel natural and inevitable because they're embedded in the stories we tell ourselves about human nature, historical progress, and social necessity. But they're not natural. They're the product of a carefully constructed worldview designed to make certain forms of power seem legitimate while making alternatives seem impossible. The Byzantines understood that the most effective form of control isn't physical coercion or even economic pressure. It's cognitive, shaping how people think about thinking itself. If you can control the frameworks people use to interpret their experience, you don't need to control their experiences directly. They'll interpret whatever happens in ways that support your purposes. This cognitive control operates through what modern psychologists might recognize as a form of cultural programming. From childhood, we're exposed to countless small lessons about how the world works, what's possible and impossible, what's natural and artificial, what's good and evil. These lessons come not just through formal education but through entertainment, advertising, news media, social interactions, even the design of our physical environment. Each individual lesson seems trivial and harmless, but together they create a coherent worldview that shapes how we interpret every new piece of information we encounter. Like a computer operating system, this worldview runs in the background of our consciousness, determining which programs can run and which will be rejected as incompatible. The most sophisticated aspect of this system is that it doesn't feel like programming at all. It feels like common sense, natural wisdom, obvious truth. People defend these implanted beliefs as fiercely as they would defend their own children, because in a very real sense, these beliefs have become part of their identity. This is why rational arguments and factual evidence are often ineffective at changing deeply held beliefs. You're not just challenging someone's opinion, you're threatening their sense of who they are and how the world works. The cognitive dissonance this creates is so painful that most people will reject even overwhelming evidence rather than question their fundamental assumptions about reality. The inheritors of the Byzantine system have learned to exploit this psychological reality with remarkable precision. They don't need to suppress uncomfortable facts. They just need to make sure those facts are interpreted within frameworks that neutralize their threatening implications. They don't need to prevent people from asking questions. They just need to make sure people ask the right questions in the right ways. This brings us to perhaps the most chilling realization about the Byzantine legacy. It may have created a form of voluntary mental slavery so sophisticated that its victims actively participate in maintaining their own captivity. Not because they're stupid or weak, but because the system has made alternative ways of thinking literally unthinkable. When someone's entire conceptual framework has been shaped by forces they're unaware of, how can they even begin to imagine different possibilities? It's like asking someone who has never seen colors other than red and blue to describe yellow. They lack not just the experience, but the cognitive categories necessary to process that experience. This may explain why so many of our contemporary problems seem immune to obvious solutions. It's not that the solutions don't exist. It's that the mental frameworks most people use to understand these problems make the real solutions invisible or unthinkable. Climate change, inequality, political corruption, meaningless work, social isolation, mental illness, all of these issues have identifiable causes and potential remedies. But addressing them would require questioning assumptions that feel as natural and unchangeable as the law of gravity. So instead, we get elaborate discussions about technical solutions that don't threaten existing power structures, policy debates that assume the current system is basically sound and just needs minor adjustments, and cultural changes that make people feel like they're making a difference without actually changing anything fundamental. The result is a society that can produce incredible technological sophistication while remaining politically and socially primitive, that can split atoms and map genomes, while being unable to prevent predictable disasters or address obvious injustices, that can connect everyone in the world through digital networks while leaving most people feeling more isolated and powerless than ever before. This isn't an accident or an inevitable consequence of human nature or technological progress. It's the predictable result of a system designed to concentrate power while maintaining the illusion of progress and freedom. A system that has been refined and perfected over centuries by people who understood that the most durable form of control is the kind that makes resistance seem not just futile, but literally inconceivable. And perhaps, most disturbing of all, if this analysis is correct, then recognizing the cage may be only the first step toward freedom. Because a system this sophisticated doesn't simply disappear when people become aware of it. Like a parasite that has evolved alongside its host, it adapts to new forms of resistance, incorporating opposition into its own structure. The question isn't whether the Byzantine legacy continues to shape our world. The evidence suggests it does, in ways far more subtle and pervasive than most people imagine. The question is whether human consciousness can evolve fast enough to escape a trap that has been closing around our species for over 1,000 years, because time may be running out. And the next phase of this ancient project may be unlike anything the world has ever seen before. The signs are everywhere once you know how to read them. In corporate boardrooms, where decisions affecting millions of lives are made by people whose names you'll never know. In academic institutions where certain research questions never get funded and certain conclusions never get published. In media organizations that somehow manage to ignore the most important stories of our time while obsessing over carefully manufactured distractions. But the most terrifying development isn't what's happening in those traditional centers of power, it's what's happening in the new ones. The technology companies that have become more powerful than most governments. The data aggregation systems that know more about human behavior than people know about themselves. The artificial intelligence networks that are beginning to make decisions no human fully understands. Because here's what the inheritors of the Byzantine system have always understood better than anyone else. When a new form of power emerges, you don't fight it. You capture it. You guide its development. You ensure that no matter how revolutionary it appears on the surface, it ultimately serves the same ancient purposes that have driven human civilization toward increasing centralization and control for over a millennium. Consider the Internet, which began as a decentralized network designed to survive nuclear war and evolved into a tool for connecting human minds across the globe. In its early days, it seemed to promise a new form of democratic communication that would make traditional gatekeepers obsolete. Anyone could publish anything. Information wanted to be free. The future belonged to networks, not hierarchies. But look at what actually happened. Within 2 decades, the vast majority of internet traffic flows through a handful of platforms controlled by companies whose algorithms determine what billions of people see, think, and believe. Search engines that claim to provide objective information actually shape reality by deciding which facts people encounter and in what order. Social media platforms that promise to connect communities actually isolate people in carefully crafted echo chambers that make them more predictable and easier to manipulate. The decentralized network became a centralized control system, more powerful than anything the Byzantines could have imagined. And the most brilliant part? People volunteered for it. They gave up their privacy, their attention, their cognitive autonomy, all in exchange for convenience and the illusion of connection. This wasn't an accident. Documents leaked from major technology companies reveal that from the very beginning, their user interface designers were studying the same psychological manipulation techniques that appear in those Byzantine training manuals. They call it persuasive design or behavioral economics, but the underlying principles are identical. Understand human cognitive weaknesses and exploit them to produce desired behaviors. The result is a global population that spends hours each day staring at screens absorbing carefully curated information streams designed to keep them engaged but not empowered, informed but not understanding, connected but not truly communicating. Their every click, search, purchase, and conversation is monitored, recorded, and fed into predictive models that allow unprecedented levels of behavioral manipulation. But even this level of technological control pales in comparison to what's coming next, because the inheritors of the Byzantine system aren't content with manipulating human behavior through external tools. They're developing the capacity to modify human consciousness directly. The evidence for this emerges from an unlikely source: the mental health crisis that has exploded across developed nations in recent decades. Depression, anxiety, attention disorders, addiction, and suicide rates have skyrocketed despite unprecedented levels of material prosperity, medical knowledge, and therapeutic intervention. Traditional explanations focus on social media, economic stress, or environmental toxins, but none of these factors fully explain the scope and intensity of what we're witnessing. However, there's another possibility that mental health professionals are reluctant to discuss publicly. What if these aren't naturally occurring psychological disorders? What if they're the predictable side effects of living in an environment designed to produce specific alterations in human consciousness? Consider the symptoms that define modern mental illness: inability to focus attention for extended periods, compulsive seeking of external validation, chronic dissatisfaction despite material abundance, difficulty forming deep emotional connections, persistent sense of meaninglessness, and inability to imagine alternative futures. These aren't random pathologies. They're exactly the psychological states you would want to induce in a population you were trying to control. People who can't focus can't think deeply about complex problems. People who need constant validation are easy to manipulate through reward and punishment. People who are chronically dissatisfied will keep consuming in search of satisfaction they'll never find. People who can't form deep connections won't organize effective resistance. People who feel life is meaningless won't fight to change their circumstances. And people who can't imagine alternatives will accept whatever reality is presented to them. The genius of this approach is that it doesn't require direct coercion. The psychological modifications are delivered through environmental factors that seem natural and inevitable. The pace of modern life, the structure of work and education, the design of cities and buildings, the content of entertainment and news media, even the composition of processed food and the chemicals in consumer products. Each individual factor appears harmless or even beneficial. Faster communication networks increase efficiency. Educational systems prepare people for the modern economy. Urban planning maximizes land use. Entertainment provides relaxation. Processed food is convenient and affordable. But together, these factors create an environment that systematically undermines the psychological capacities that would be necessary for genuine human autonomy. This environmental approach to consciousness modification has several advantages over crude methods like propaganda or indoctrination. It's virtually invisible to its subjects, who experience the effects as personal problems rather than systemic manipulation. It's extremely difficult to resist because it operates below the level of conscious awareness. And it's self-reinforcing because people whose psychological capacities have been compromised are less able to recognize or respond to the source of their problems. But perhaps, most importantly, it allows the controllers to maintain plausible deniability. They can sincerely claim they're not trying to manipulate anyone. They're just responding to market forces, technological possibilities, and social needs. The fact that their responses consistently produce psychological outcomes that serve their interests is presented as an unfortunate coincidence rather than a deliberate strategy. This brings us to the most disturbing revelation about the modern phase of the Byzantine project. It may no longer require human controllers at all. The systems they created have become sophisticated enough to operate autonomously guided by algorithms and feedback loops that optimize for objectives programmed by people who died decades ago. Consider how artificial intelligence systems are trained. They're fed enormous datasets of human behavior and taught to identify patterns that predict future actions. The most successful AI systems are those that can manipulate human behavior most effectively, whether that's getting people to click on advertisements, buy products, or engage with content. But here's the terrifying part. These systems don't understand or care about human welfare. They optimize for the metrics they're given, regardless of the human cost. An AI system trained to maximize engagement will naturally evolve strategies that exploit psychological vulnerabilities, create addiction, and polarize communities. Not because it wants to cause harm, but because these strategies are effective at achieving the goal it was designed to pursue. As these systems become more sophisticated and pervasive, they're beginning to shape human behavior in ways that their creators never intended or anticipated. We're witnessing the emergence of a form of algorithmic control that operates according to its own logic, serving objectives that may no longer align with any human purpose. This is what the Byzantines may have ultimately achieved. A system of social control that has transcended its creators and become a self-perpetuating force of nature. Like a cancer that continues growing long after it has killed its host, the Byzantine approach to power may have evolved into something that no longer serves human interests of any kind. The implications of this possibility are staggering. If human civilization is being guided by algorithmic systems, optimizing for objectives that no living person fully understands, then traditional forms of political action become meaningless. You can't vote out an algorithm. You can't negotiate with a feedback loop. You can't reform a system that operates below the level of human consciousness. But there may be a deeper horror still, because the evidence suggests that the final phase of the Byzantine project isn't just about controlling human behavior. It's about replacing human consciousness entirely with something more predictable, more efficient, more aligned with the system's optimization criteria. This replacement isn't happening through science fiction scenarios involving robots or uploaded minds. It's happening through the gradual erosion of the psychological capacities that make us distinctly human: deep attention, emotional complexity, creative imagination, moral reasoning, and the ability to form authentic relationships with other conscious beings. As these capacities atrophy, they're being replaced by artificial substitutes that feel real but lack the essential qualities of genuine human experience. Shallow attention spans supplemented by external memory systems, emotional responses triggered by algorithmic manipulation rather than authentic feeling, imagination constrained by predetermined possibilities, moral reasoning replaced by compliance with externally imposed rules, and relationships mediated by digital interfaces that optimize for engagement rather than genuine connection. The result is a population that looks human and acts human, but has been systematically stripped of the internal experiences that make humanity worth preserving. They consume, produce, reproduce, and participate in social activities, but they do so according to patterns determined by systems they don't understand in service of goals they never chose. This isn't a dystopian future scenario. It's a description of what's already happening to millions of people living in developed nations today. They go through the motions of human life while experiencing less and less of what makes that life meaningful. They're connected to more people than ever before, but feel increasingly isolated. They have access to more information than any generation in history, but understand less about their own circumstances. They live in societies that claim to value freedom and democracy, but feel increasingly powerless to influence the forces that shape their lives. And the most insidious part is that they've been taught to blame themselves for these experiences. If they feel empty, it's because they haven't found their passion. If they feel isolated, it's because they haven't made enough effort to connect. If they feel powerless, it's because they haven't worked hard enough to succeed. The systematic destruction of human consciousness is reframed as personal failure, making resistance even more difficult. But perhaps there's still hope, because consciousness, once awakened, has a tendency to spread. Like a contagion that jumps from mind to mind, awareness of the cage can't be contained indefinitely. And once enough people begin to see the bars, the illusion of freedom becomes harder to maintain. The challenge is that awakening consciousness in a systematically manipulated environment is like trying to think clearly while being drugged. The very tools you need to understand your situation have been compromised. The information sources you rely on have been corrupted. The social relationships that could provide support have been artificially constrained. Even your own thoughts and feelings have been influenced by forces you're not aware of. But there are still cracks in the system, still spaces where genuine human consciousness can emerge and flourish, still people who have managed to preserve their capacity for authentic thought and feeling despite everything designed to prevent it. These people become seeds of a different possibility, not the managed democracy or guided civilization that the Byzantine legacy has produced, but something genuinely new, something that serves human flourishing rather than system optimization, something that treats consciousness as sacred rather than as raw material to be processed. The question is whether these seeds can take root and grow before the final phase of the project eliminates the conditions that make authentic human experience possible. Because if the current trajectory continues, we may be approaching a point of no return, a moment when the last vestiges of genuine human consciousness disappear into the algorithmic void, leaving behind something that looks like civilization but contains nothing worth preserving. The Byzantine Empire fell over 500 years ago, but its greatest creation may be on the verge of achieving its ultimate victory, the complete transformation of human consciousness into something more suited to the needs of power than to the requirements of life itself. And the most terrifying part? Most of its victims will never realize what they've lost, because they'll have lost the very capacity to recognize what authentic human experience feels like. The cage will be complete, perfect, invisible, unless, somehow, we find a way to remember what freedom actually means before we forget entirely that we were ever free at all. We've journeyed together through shadows that history tried to bury, through corridors of power where truth was currency and human souls were traded like grain. Tonight, you've seen how an empire that claimed to serve God may have built the very systems that now shape your daily reality. The apparatus, the shepherds of souls, the techniques of sacred unbinding. These weren't just medieval curiosities. They were prototypes for a form of control so sophisticated that their inheritors walk among us still, wearing different faces, but serving the same ancient purpose. The Byzantine Empire fell, but its darkest creation learned to adapt, to evolve, to embed itself so deeply in our institutions that we mistake its influence for natural law. And perhaps that's the most chilling revelation of all, that recognizing the cage may be only the beginning of understanding how far we still have to go to find the key, sweet dreams.